What's going on, guys? It's going to be our Summary of Markets Week 56. Then we're going to get into our options watch list. Let's get started with SPY as always. So a little bloody week. Last week, pretty much no buy pressure throughout the entire week. You had one day where it shot up really quickly, looked like it was actually going to go into all-time highs, and then it just instantly sold off on the next morning. So a little bit of a bull trap. You hit our targets around 391, 393. You just weren't able to hold above those levels. So you had that bear trap on February 24th, massive wick down into the lows on February 23rd, which actually sustained that move. And then you saw a lower failure on February 26th. So you came back to retest the OTS trail around 385, 386, could not hold above that level. And we did retest it as resistance, sold off down to the 50-day moving average. So right now, we can say that it is holding support. It is technically holding the 50-day moving average. You are also holding the monthly VWAP. But once you have lost, I'd say like 377, where's the monthly VWAP? Let's take a look. 377. Once you lose that monthly VWAP, it is looking pretty bearish, and it's most likely going to continue lower. I'm going to talk about it later in the video when we go over the indexes, but QS has already lost its monthly VWAP, so the tech sector is already selling off. That's one thing to keep in note as you are trading SPY or anything that's in the broad market. You are not bullish right now. You are testing support, but you are not bullish. Now, if it does start to bounce off these supports, and I'd say reclaim around 386, then you could start saying that's a bullish bounce, okay? So look for a reclaim of like 386. If it does do that, I would be bullish into like 392, 393. If you can hold above those levels, as always, look for that 400 target that we've been waiting on. Now, if it does lose 377, like I said, I think it can go lower. Keep an eye on that support around 374, and then the main target would be somewhere around 370 to 368. Moving on to gold, as we talked about, still in that bearish channel, not able to find any buyers once you start pushing towards the upper side of that channel. Did see a nasty sell-off on Thursday and Friday, continuing that move down into the 1770 and 1750 targets. You also hit that middle of the channel as well. So it's getting pretty bearish here. If we zoom out a little bit, we can see, where's my brush? We can see that this could easily drop down to like 1663. If we zoom out, there's really not a whole lot of support. We broke the pivots here. You had a little bit of a point of origin play there. There's no pivots in this area. So down to 1663, that's your next major daily pivot. There's not a whole lot of support. So be on the lookout for that. Could easily drop down. This, I think, was the main thing that brought down silver. So if you were trading SLV like I was last week, silver looked pretty good. You broke the pivot, started to consolidate above it, but then once gold had that nasty sell-off Thursday and Friday, silver continued, or followed, I should say. So gold here, like I said, you could easily go down to 1663, but if you do find support around 1750, watch for the Momo here. You did have that green to red flip, but if this turns green again, this could be putting in a bull div. So keep an eye on that. If this immediately turns green, or even if it turns green in the next few days, this will be putting in a bull div, and we could see a quick retrace back into that 1770 area. If that does happen, I would assume that that would be the move that finally sends it outside of this channel, because it would need a lot of buy pressure to get back into that area. So if you do get that buy pressure pushing you back up into the 1800s, I would definitely play that as a bullish sign that is most likely going to break this channel and finally break out into the 1900s. But don't predict the bull div. Just be on the lookout for if it does show up. And if it does show up, you would be targeting around 1810 to 1800. And then if you hold above those levels, look for that 1900 area. Going back into oil, oil has continued its strength basically through the past 2 weeks, 3 weeks. You were pretty strong last week until Friday. Nasty sell-off on Friday, pulling back into that $60 area, but tons of support around 59 and 60. If you can hold above 59, I'd say this easily goes higher to 65, 66, somewhere around there. If we start holding below 60, I would be on the lookout for that retest of this little distribution back here. That distribution put in a pivot around 53, and you have that Fibonacci support around 52 to 54. Okay, so lots of support in that area. So if you do hold below 60, kind of like a little bearish, maybe like a bear flag or a little accumulation, most likely could retrace down to like 54, 55. All right. For now, I would not predict the pullback as long as it stays above the OTS trail, as long as it stays green on the OTS daily, OTS 4-hour. This is most likely going to continue higher. Short-term pullback maybe, but the overall oil market is pretty bullish right now. All right, moving on to Bitcoin. Had a nasty week last week, finally seeing that sell-off. As I discussed in Discord, I said it looked like it was in for a 20% pullback on the weekly. That basically is what happened. You have a big, nasty weekly candle pulling you back. Let's see, 22% so far. And honestly, it could go lower. It is still pretty extended. Now on the daily, I wouldn't say this is very extended anymore. This could be a massive bullish area to buy the bounce. But on the weekly, I would say this is still extended. Okay, but if it does get below, I'd say 43,000. I would be looking for around 40,000 to 37, back where that previous sell-off happened in January. That would be your major support if it does continue to fall. Now, the daily, as I said, this could be considered bullish. You're no longer very extended. You have kind of the support back here above that initial area where you had that little bull flag breakout. So you have a lot of buyers probably in this area, anywhere from 37 to 40. So as long as you stay above 37 to 40, I'd say on the daily, this is a bullish pullback. You do have the 50-day moving average right around 41. So if you do lose that 50-day, which we have not lost since way back around like 8,000, if you do start to lose that, I would then start to shift into more of a bearish mindset. Okay, but for now, it is looking like a dip buy scenario. If you do reclaim around 48.5, I would be looking for around 52 to 54,000. Similar price action with Ethereum, but I'd say Ethereum is a little more bearish because it is deeper than the 50 moving average already. So you had the 50 moving average that we have not lost since like 360, 370, somewhere around there, and we just lost it. So we've already lost it for about 3 days. You also had the bounce yesterday, which came back to retest it, and you still failed. Okay, you have a major pivot above you around 1600. If you can reclaim that pivot above 1600, I would be bullish. Now, I would be slightly worried about the OTS trail that's catching up because you did flip red on the OTS trail, which you have not done for a very long time. Okay, so this is entering a deep pullback. Now, if you reclaim the pivot, I would say you're bullish, but that trail is going to be right on you. Okay, so this could be a bullish kind of a bull trap where you bounce up, it looks very good, reclaiming the pivot, you just can't get above that trail, and then you sell off. Okay, so if you see something like that, I would be very careful. But if this can bounce, reclaim the pivot, and also reclaim the trail, I would be very bullish into around 2,000, maybe around 1,900 to be safe. But I think if you can reclaim the trail, easily could get to 1,900 or 2,000. All right. For now, as long as it stays below the pivot, as long as it stays below the 50, I would be targeting these bearish levels. So you have around 1,300, which you already hit. If it breaks that, 1075 and then 1,000. Okay. But that is the summary of markets. Let's move on to the options watch list. So right now, due to the massive pullback in the markets, I'm not looking at too many things. I want the indexes to kind of correct before I start hopping into any growth names or any value names. We are seeing a shift from the growth sector into the value sector, I believe, with all the big names in the EV sector and the tech sector. They are selling off pretty heavily. Now, the tech sector does typically outperform. So the tech sector does normally go up more and go down more. So when the market starts to correct and the tech sector does worse than the other sectors, you can't always say that's a rotation because that sector usually outperforms anyway. But what I would say, which I am going to go over here, is if you look at the value ETFs, look at like IWD, the Russell 1000 value. You have IVE is another value one. VONV is also a value ETF. These ETFs are pulling back, but they are also breaking into all-time highs. So these ETFs are doing very well. So the value ETFs, even when the tech sector, if you look at all the big tech names, they've been pulling back pretty deep. When all these big tech names, and we also have all the big EV names like NIO, Tesla, they're also pulling back very heavily. The value ETFs are doing fine. So what I will say for the watch list is I would not be very growth heavy. I would not be very tech heavy moving into the next few weeks. Now, if you're a long-term trader, long-term investor, you like buying dips on any of these big names, that's a different story. But for the short-term traders, I would be looking more towards hospitality. I'd be looking more towards real estate. I'd be looking more towards travel. And then also any of the big value names. Okay. We're going to go over a few of those. Like CCL, big one on my watch list, has been doing very well. Once it broke that inverse head and shoulders around $22, I called out NCLH for the exact same trade because if we look at the chart, it was doing the exact same thing, but it was taking longer to do it. So this had a laggard trade basically, and it caught up very quickly. So all of these cruise line stocks, they are breaking out of a massive range that they were in since the coronavirus bottom. Now, any pullback to retest this area of the coronavirus accumulation is going to be very bullish, which we just saw on CCL. So CCL pulled back to retest that, basically we can call it the corona high, and we bounced right off of it. You also reclaim the pivot at 26.5. Now, if the markets continue to sell off very rapidly, then I think these travel stocks are definitely going to pull back with the market. But if the market does recover or it stays steady, I think these travel stocks are going to continue to run. Now, if CCL gets back below 25, I would be looking for a deeper pullback, maybe back towards 23, maybe 22.25. But for now, as long as it stays above that COVID high, this is looking very bullish and could easily hit 30 within the next few weeks. Another ETF that I'm looking at is Jets. Jets is a basically an ETF of all the big airliners. They've also been doing very well. Same thought process here. You can look at the COVID high. You could also look at the previous high that we just broke out of. It's breaking out of major resistance. Okay. So if we zoom out, you still have COVID gaps on a lot of these travel companies. They have not retraced far enough to fulfill their COVID gap fills. So they gapped down very heavily when COVID started, and they have not filled them. So that gives you a very easy mid to long-term target on all of these stocks. Now, with that said, if Jets does continue higher, I would be looking for that gap fill around $29 to $30. Any pullback down to like 24 to 22 would be bullish in my eyes. Now, Boeing is one of the big stocks you want to look at in the travel sector. They have been getting a lot of bad news recently. A couple of their planes having to have emergency landings. I think one of their engines like fell off their plane mid-flight or something ridiculous. So they have been getting some bad news. But technical analysis, looking at the charts, it looks pretty good. It looks ready to run. Especially if you look at the broad travel sector, they are doing very well. So with Boeing breaking out of this downward channel here, breaking back above a lot of its resistance around 206 to 210, this has become a massive support. So even with the bad news, if Boeing pulls back to these pivots, to this VWAP, I would assume this is going to be a dip that's going to get bought up very quickly. You could also consider this being an inverse head and shoulders. Now, you would consider that a breakout if that was an inverse head and shoulders, but this was not a technical failure. This was due to a lot of the bad news coming out. So this could still be an inverse head and shoulders with a pullback here. So if you do pull back and you break back above like 218, you would be targeting that VWAP around 227 and then the previous high around 245. Another company that I like that would be considered value, I believe in my eyes, FedEx on basically the same play Boeing has, inverse head and shoulders, reclaiming VWAP, reclaiming pivots. If it can hold it back above like 255, I would say this could break to 272 very quickly. You are getting a daily buy the dip signal. and you're also getting the black to white shift on the OTS. Snapchat is another name that I like a lot, pulling back to retest the initial breakout point. Now, you did hit our final target already. Snapchat had a final target of around 72, 73. That target has been hit. So I can go ahead and delete this Fibonacci here. We can go ahead and grab a new one. And if I grab this most recent impulse here, excuse me, we could be seeing 74 to 76 as our close resistance, and then our breakout targets around 82 to 85. Now, for Snapchat to be bullish, you have to stay above the OTS trail here on the daily, and you would also have to stay above that pivot around 63.5. If you can maintain above 67.73, the fake out level, then you're looking for those first targets. That is basically it on my watch list, to be honest. But before we close this, I am going to go over the broad indexes. We already went over SPY. Let me just briefly show that one more time. So SPY is still holding the 50-day moving average, but the level that I am watching the most is this dotted line right here. This is the monthly VWAP. Now, historically, if SPY loses its monthly VWAP, it tends to sell off pretty heavily, like we saw here and like we saw here. You typically don't see any major sell-offs as long as it holds above the monthly VWAP. The previous monthly VWAP, I should say. But it's holding as support right now, but you're getting very close. If this can break this 377, I would be looking for around 368 as that next monthly VWAP to hold as support. If that fails, it has been a very long time since we have lost 2 previous months. We've lost 1 month and recovered. It's been a very long time since we've lost 2 months. The last time, I believe, would be the COVID dip. So if it starts to lose 368, that's when I would probably start looking at taking some pretty big hedges to the downside and also looking at some bearish market scenarios. QS has already lost its monthly VWAP, but because SPY has not lost its VWAP, I would not consider this extremely bearish. It is definitely bearish, but I would not be considering this extremely bearish until SPY loses its VWAP at 377. Now, for now, QS has another VWAP at around 307 that it needs to hold. If it loses that VWAP, you are looking at a pretty bad sell-off, probably down to the pivot around 292. Okay? Now, looking at IWM, it still has some room to go before it gets to its monthly VWAP. Because it had such a strong run on that previous all-time high break, you still have a lot of room to protect yourself to the downside here. If it does break 208, I would be looking for around 193 as the next VWAP. Finally, we have the Dow Jones pulling back to the 50-day moving average, but it is also maintaining its VWAP. So the only one out of all 4 indexes that's lost its monthly VWAP is the tech sector, the Qs. So if Dow Jones loses its VWAP, you would probably most likely be looking at 300 to 301 as your next support. Now, it has already turned black on the OTS, so you are definitely getting sell pressure, but I would not be too bearish until you lose that 307 level. But all right, guys, that is the summary markets and our options watch list. Hopefully you guys liked this video. If you did, make sure to hit that like button, and I will be seeing you guys for our live trading session tomorrow at 9:30. See you.